So in today's lecture, we're going to cover value proposition. What is it you're building and for who? What pains and gains are you creating for what customer segments? And more importantly, what's the minimum viable product that results from all this knowledge? So you're all familiar with the business model canvas. And hopefully by now you've actually taken a shot and try to fill out the canvas for your own idea in your own startup. But today we're going to talk about the first box, value proposition. Value proposition is just a fancy word in the business model canvas for what is it that you're building. What product or service are you building? And by the way, we're going to ask later, for who are you building it? And what exactly does it solve for those people? So let's take a look at value proposition. As I said, it's not just about your idea or product. One of the things that's hard for founders to realize, there's actually a customer at the other end. And so while you're thinking this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, the whole idea about customer development is to get you out of the building and tell me whose need or problem you're solving. It's about satisfying a customer need, not just you thinking, what a great idea. And that can't be repeated enough. So today, while we're talking about value proposition works hand in hand with who your customers are, which we'll be talking about in the next lecture. Understand that this relationship between what you're building, the value proposition, and the customer is what makes startups succeed or fail on day one right there. And we give those two boxes, those two relationships, a special name. We call that product market fit. And when you hear the phrase product market fit, just simply visualize the canvas and go, oh, that's another fancy word that says, is what I'm building needed or wanted or passionately desired by a set of customers on the other end? And if I don't have that, then the good news is about the customer development process is it allows us to keep searching without going out of business. And so what you'll find is we'll be iterating back and forth, doing things called pivots and iterations as we kind of discover what customers really want versus what we think we're building for them. So looking at the business model canvas, fill in the box where your product would go, and then fill in the box where your market would go. Well, the product goes into the box labeled value proposition. As we'll see later, the value proposition includes all the features of your product, but also what pains and gains you're solving for the customer segment. And that's where the market goes. Market includes who your customers are, what problems you're solving for them. What name do we give the relationship between the value proposition and the customer segment? The answer is product market fit, finding the right balance between the minimum viable product and the customer archetypes. So let's take a look at value proposition. Now, value proposition is not something you're building in isolation. While the value proposition is about solving a customer problem or need, it really consists of three components. The easy one for most entrepreneurs to talk about is what product features you have or what product services you're providing. But there's actually two more important components to value proposition. What gain are you creating for customers, and what pain are you solving for them? Alexander Osterwalder, when he drew the business model canvas, really emphasized this. It's not just about your product. And especially if you come from a technical background, it's really easy to see, oh, look at all these features. And if you find yourself doing that, you need to complete the sentence and say, yes, but here's what we make people be able to do better, and here are the problems we solve for them. So the real goal of you figuring out the value proposition is understanding what we call the minimal viable product. You're trying to figure out, now that I kind of understand my product and service and that what I'm gaining for customers and what pain I'm solving, what's the smallest possible feature set I could be shipping on day one that solves these pains and creates gains for them? And this really is an interactive process because there's no way, no possible way, sitting in your office, you could figure this out. And the default for great engineers and great entrepreneurs is, oh, I understand customers' problems and needs, so, don't worry about it. We'll just spec the entire product on day one. Your real goal here is to figure out what's the smallest thing
you could build and develop that actually get you users or sales or whatever and get out to market as quickly as possible. And so the goal of you getting out of the building for value proposition is understanding gains and pains so you can figure out what's the MVP, or minimum viable product. When planning an initial product, which is the most important? Choose from the list below. The answer is, when you're planning an initial product, the most important is finding sufficient features to solve a problem for a known group of customers. Matching competitive features is what we used to do, and actually is a going out of business strategy, unless you're in an existing market and you happen to know which features customers have told you are more important. Having sufficient features to meet all of customer needs, startups just don't have the resources to do every possible wish that a customer has, at least on day one. And so really what you want to do is focus on enough features to solve a problem important enough for a known group of customers. That's kind of wonderful, but we keep talking about the customer. Let me remind you what it looks like from their side, and we'll be talking about customers in more detail in the next lecture, but let me just give you a preview. In customer segments, you're also looking for three things. One is you are still trying to understand from this side what are the gains, what are the pains, but also what are the jobs the customers want you to do. What are the functional or social jobs? What are the emotional jobs? What are the basic needs that you're going to be solving or problems? And the goal of all this is not just to understand this, but to understand it in enough detail that you could actually draw the persona or archetype of those customers and put them on the wall of your engineering department. Because now they could stare at faces that you'll clip out and specs of how old they are, where they live, what job they're trying to get done, and what pains and gains your value proposition is trying to solve for them. And until you do that, you're just going to be making products in the dark. Why is having a customer archetype important? Choose all that apply. The answer is having a customer archetype in mind is really important for all of these. To know who to talk to during customer development, to determine how do you actually sell and market to these customers. They'll tell you if you ask them. To guide how you form hypotheses during product development. And to help define the minimum viable product. Knowing the customers and who they are will be immensely valuable. So as we said, understanding these three components of value proposition work together with understanding the three components of customer segment. And in value proposition, the goal of this is to find out the minimum viable product. And in customer segments, the goal is to understand in detail the customer archetype or persona. And again, this equals product market fit.
I can't emphasize enough that the business model canvas is just a start. It's great to strategize and think about who customer segments are and value proposition and channel, but remember, all you're doing is writing down hypotheses. Your job is to turn those hypotheses into facts. And there are no facts inside your building. So your job is to get outside and test them personally in a physical channel by talking to hundreds of customers, in a web and mobile channel by talking to thousands virtually and some portion physically. You need to watch people's pupils dilate when they actually see and like your product.
So let's take a look at the value proposition in a little more detail and expand on those three components. The first one is your product, and as we said earlier, you need to understand which are part of your value proposition. Is it just hardware or software or bits, or are there going to be some manufacturing goods, some commodities? Are you going to have intangible products that are part, copyrights and licenses that are part of your value proposition? Are you going to have any financial products, that is guarantees or insurance policies or maintenance contracts? Or are you going to add some digital features as well? The only point here is to realize that your product and service is not just the bits or hardware, it's actually the whole product, the entire package that you're going to be delivering. And a value proposition for a company that's selling services is kind of the same. You just need to ask, what are the core services that are part of your value proposition? consulting, haircut, investment advice. And if you're selling software or hardware, you could have separate services that are part of this whole product. Pre- and post-sales services, finding the right solution, financing, free delivery. Amazon makes a great business because, in fact, they could do one-day delivery or they could do two-day premier service. That is, services sometimes, while might seem to be ancillary or kind of add-ons, actually make your products look better than their competitors. And then what are after-sales services? Free maintenance, disposal, etc. And so all these add up, again, to what is it that your product features do. Looking at the Amazon website for books, which of the following are part of Amazon's products? Pick all that apply. Well, if you look at the Amazon website, not at Kindle or AWS, but just their traditional book-selling website, you find that all of these things are part of their product. The website for allowing users to find and buy products, a review system and rating system for products, protection against fraud for marketplace sellers, and the content itself, movies, books, music, etc. The sum of all of these are what makes up Amazon's complete product. But as you remember, I said it's not only about your product or service features, it's also about painkillers. That is, what are you going to reduce or eliminate for the customer? So here's a couple of hypotheses of what some painkillers might be. Because painkiller, until now, might have sounded like, well, wait a minute, do I hand the customers aspirin? And the answer is, yeah, you're really going to solve a pain for them, but the pain might be, is your product going to produce savings, that is in time or money or efforts? Is it going to make them feel better? That is, entertainment products don't solve a problem, but they solve a need. Does it kill frustration, annoyances, or things that give them a headache? Does it fix solutions they already have but are underperforming because you have new features or you're better or faster? Or does it end difficulties and challenges that customers encounter every day? Does it make things easier or help them get things done or eliminate resistance? Does it wipe out or add to negative social consequences, loss of face, power, or trust, or add to social status like Facebook and Twitter, etc., or even LinkedIn? Or does it eliminate risk? Is it financial, social, or technical risks, or what could go very wrong? So painkillers, your hypotheses, should include which one of these or some others. Because this list is finite, there might be other things you're solving and taking away pain from customers. But you need to be able to articulate, based on your interactions outside the building with customers, here's what they said, and when I bounced our product off of them, they said, yeah, that really solves this pain, and more importantly, is an important pain. By the way, just as an aside, I've been talking about problem or need as part of the product. And I just want you to remember, it's kind of interesting to differentiate between solving a problem. Somebody has an accounting problem or a word processor, or they can now use Google Docs versus Microsoft Word, versus a need. What's a need? Well, a need might be need to be entertained, a need to communicate. Needs are something that are universal across all 7 billion people on the planet. Your total available market, plus or minus a couple billion, maybe kids 0 to 5 don't have those needs, but eventually you will find market sizes for needs to be multiples by orders of magnitude above solving problems. And so I'm not suggesting that you don't solve problems. I'm not suggesting that you try to turn every problem into a need. But let me suggest the one company in the 21st century that did this better than anybody else on the planet was Apple and the iPhone. They took a communications device and made it a status symbol. And they transitioned from a product that solved a problem, integrated web browser, email, and phone, into something that people now every year obsolete their own products by wanting to get the next one because it's now a need rather than a product. Just some tactics in figuring out pains. I'd rank each pain that your products and or services kill according to their intensity for the customer. And what you're looking for is trying to understand, is this a life-saving pain? Or, I've lived with this for years, we could live with it for another couple of years. How important is it in the list of pains that customers have in the area that you're serving? And the other thing you want to think about is not only how intense is the pain, but how often does it occur? If it occurs just once a year, people might live with it. But if it's occurring daily or hourly, you are maybe solving something pretty important. And finally, the last piece in detail is what gain are you creating? What are the benefits the customer expects, desires, or is surprised about? So again, you're going to start with your hypotheses. What makes the customer happy? That is, are you going to create savings in time or money and effort? Is this a product that delights them because the outcome is better than you could even imagine, better quality, or more of something or less of something they didn't like? Does it just simply outperform current solutions that delight a customer? Does it make your customer's job or life easier? Or does it create positive consequences that a customer desires? Again, it could be a social consequence for a need. It could be a business consequence. They get more sales, etc. And so, much like thinking through pain, you'll start with a set of hypotheses, but the only way to understand this is outside the building in front of lots of customers. Much like ranking pain, I want you to think about ranking gains. And so think about and make a list of what each gain your products and services create according to its relevance to the customer. This is a big idea, the relevance to the customer. Because much like in pain, you're going to make your first list thinking, you got it. Here's what I'm going to solve for pain, and here's what I'm going to create for gain. I absolutely know this. Why? Because it's my opinion, or I might have been a domain expert. But you know what? At the end of the day, your business isn't about your opinion. What you need to do is now hear this from customers who say, here's why it's relevant. And much like pains, you want to understand, is this a substantial or insignificant gain creator? And again, understand the frequency that it occurs. This is where the difference between physical and web mobile channels first come into play. Because the MVP for a physical channel, that is, something you sell directly through stores and with a direct sales force, is very different than something that you might be building for the web or even more so for a mobile channel. So in a physical channel, what you really want to have is something that customers can touch and feel because you're going to be out talking to them. And while you could certainly go out with a PowerPoint deck with a photo of what the product's going to look like, etc., my advice always is invest a day or two in building something, even if it's out of styrofoam and cardboard, or if it's something as small as a chip, a microphotograph, or a microphotograph of a proposed die layout. That is, almost for any physical product, you should probably be going out and trying to get some reaction based on something that people could see and touch. And in doing that, you're going to test your understanding of the problem, test your understanding of the solution, and when you do that, it's going to prove that it solves the core problem for the customers. And you're going to learn what the minimum set of features are from the early evangelists. In a physical channel, this requires lots of interviews, demos, and prototypes, and lots of eyeball contact. In a web or mobile product, instead of building a physical prototype, you need to have a low-fidelity app or website available for customer feedback. What does low fidelity mean? Well, that's just kind of my description of you don't need an entire finished website, but you should at least have a wireframe. And if you don't have a wireframe, you should at least have a PowerPoint of mock-ups or a flash demo or something so people could see not only what you're describing in words, but actually could say, oh, I get it. Now remember, don't demo that first. Your goal here is to first understand the problem. And I make people sometimes who like to give demos leave all that stuff home when you're first having the problem discussion. But the minute you get into the, well, would something like this solve your problem? For a web mobile app, you really want to get feedback on a low-fidelity app as quickly as possible. And when we teach this as a class, literally by the second week of the class, if you're building a web and mobile app, you have to have your site or wireframe up and running so people can actually see it and give you feedback. Later on, you're going to build what I call the high-fidelity app, and that tests your understanding of the solution. This actually has most of the features, might not have health files, the graphics might not be complete, but a high-fidelity app gives you more resolution on, well, we really didn't like that color, the button was in the wrong place, etc. This helps you avoid building products no one wants, and it maximizes the learning per time spent on the product and on customers. Now, why you're doing all this is to define the minimum viable product, or sometimes called the MVP for short. The MVP basically is what product or service you're building in your first instance that's delivered to customers. And the MVP is not an alpha or beta. This is a big idea. In the old days, the product development process would go from seed funding to concept to a market requirements document to an engineering requirements document and blow out into an entire waterfall development process. And part of those steps were alpha test, beta test, and first customer ship. And you'd be shipping and telling customers, here's a buggy, unfinished product. Why don't you test it for me? And then you'd always argue with sales about whether you should charge for it or not. But the MVP is actually quite different. The MVP says, no, we're not speccing a version 1.0 product that has a spec 18 pages long. We're actually doing the work outside the building first and trying to understand what's the minimum version of a version 1.0. Not what engineering or the founders thought, but what is it customers are going to tell us they'll pay for or use now. And while it might be, quote, a beta product, we never use that word. We actually tell customers it's a minimum viable product. What's the purpose of a minimum viable product? Take a look at the list and pick the appropriate answer. So the question is, what's the purpose of a minimum viable product? It turns out that the answer is pretty specific. You want to test the ability of some portion of your product to meet minimum customer needs, and that might change over time. That is, the MVP slowly grows as your confidence in who the customer archetype is. It's not how to get as much revenue as you can as early as you can. You might decide that's a strategy, but that's kind of counter in learning from an MVP. You typically only make this choice when you actually feel pretty certain that you understand product market fit. And while we certainly want to identify bugs in a product, hopefully if we've been using an agile methodology, we've kind of squashed most of them before they've gone out the door. Explicitly, the goal of an MVP is not an engineering alpha or beta test. The goal is not to use this process to find all the bugs, though they might come up. The goal of an MVP is to actually test the ability of the product to meet minimal customer needs, as in choice 1. Now, for both physical and mobile channels, there's an art to building a minimum viable product. Just think about this. An MVP is not a minimal product. An MVP is not like, well, we only have 3 weeks, so we cut off the feature list here. That's not what an MVP is. An MVP is based on interaction and iteration in understanding customers' needs and pains and gains. And if all you're doing is cutting off the feature list, then you clearly haven't run the process. Sometimes we get, but my customers really don't know what they want. I'm creating something so new, getting out of the building is just a waste of time because if I show them my solution, they're not even going to know what planet I'm talking about. We're going to be talking about the problem of market type in a subsequent lecture. But there's a case called the new market, where you're right, customers have never seen an iPhone before or never seen a new product before. In that case, you still want to get out of the building, but instead of asking them about features, you actually want to understand how are they spending their time now and what solutions are they using to solve their pains and gains. And so we'll talk about market type later, but when you hear people say, but my customers don't know what they want, just park that for a while because that's not an excuse to stay in the building and keep adding features. There's a couple of mistakes when you're thinking about value proposition. One is that what you're building might just be a feature of someone else's product. You might have a good feature extension, but it might not be a business. Or it might be a business for about 9 months till the incumbent just adds that in their next release. As I said earlier, these prioritizations of pains and gains sometimes helps you avoid the it's nice to have problem. So sometimes it's very easy for founders to say, well, they all liked it. Well, okay, what you really want is they didn't like it. They got to have it. In fact, they didn't let me leave until they let me use the prototype. That's when you know you have a business. It has to be something that people demand, and there have to be enough of them to demand. You might find, yeah, I found the 5 people in the entire world that love the product, but that might not be a large enough market. Some of the questions you might want to be asking as you're outside the building now, talking to customers, is competition. Competition kind of exists outside the business model canvas. Think of the canvas now floating in a world where other people's business model canvases are floating as well. And so just kind of take a step back and go, well, who else is out there? And what are they doing? The next thing you want to be asking, again, outside the canvas, why is this problem so hard to solve? Or why is this service not being done by other people? It might be that hopefully you really do have a insight or breakthrough. Or it might be you're hallucinating. And so you really do need to keep asking that question, not only to yourself, go ask it to the people you're talking to. Ask them, has anybody done this? And if they go, yeah, we've never seen it, ask them why. Why do you think? You might get some insight like, oh yeah, there have been 9 vendors in the last, 3.5 years who tried this and they all failed. Warning, you might want to investigate why that happened. Hopefully you have a different approach or different insight than anybody else. And as we kept talking about earlier, market size. We're going to be talking about how to size the market at the end of this lecture. But you really do want to understand how big is this problem and is this what we want to spend our next couple years doing? And then finally, as we said, how do you do it once you understand the customer needs? So an additional help in thinking about your value proposition comes from a great VC, Ann Muraco at Floodgate. And Ann said, we could think of startups' value propositions of having 2 forms. Do they have technology insight or are they market insights? And typically technology insights come for technology-driven products. Are you building chips that follow Moore's law? That is, they're now doubling in density every year and therefore new functions can be embedded in them. Are these based on new scientific discoveries or new algorithms? Typically this applies to hardware or clean tech and biotech, but it also could be big data algorithms, etc. Do you have some insight about technology and again the gains and pains that they will provide for customers? Or do you have some insight about the market or consumer behavior? Are you going to disrupt the value chain because you now understand how to do something overseas where you could slash the cost by 80%? Is there something that government regulation or deregulation is going to change and now make an entire industry available in a way it never was before? So these are about changes in how people work and live and interact and what they expect, and these are very different than technology insights. But remember, they both need to solve pains and gains for your customer. So there's another way to look at this, types of value propositions, kind of as a Venn diagram. So what comes from technical insights are making things more efficient or smaller or faster, and sometimes lower cost and simpler. What comes from market insights are better distribution and bundling and branding. But sometimes what you have is this sweet spot in the middle that actually is a combination of technical and market insights that makes for a killer value proposition. So let's take a look at some examples of technical insights. There's a company called Isidia that was an outgrowth of the Stanford Math Department, where a PhD student said, listen, we could do a topological analysis of highly dimensional data to be analyzed without predetermining the number of feature sets. Boy, that's a mouthful, but it turns out that this is the world's best way to go through big data sets, huge data sets, in a way that was just computationally not possible before. And in fact, once they had their technical insight, they started to talk to customers about pains and gains, and it was an enormously effective product to solve problems that were so painful they just couldn't be approached before. Another example was a startup called Inscopus that mass-produced components to create a miniaturized fluorescence microscope. It turns out that this technical insight allowed them to reduce the size of a device that took up a tabletop that could now fit in your hand. And in fact, they created an entirely new market that solved problems that customers didn't even imagine until they actually saw this new device. On the other hand, there are some examples of market insight. Zynga was one of the first companies to realize that people wanted to play games online that were more involved than were currently offered. They not only wanted to play solitaire, but they actually wanted to play games that involved interaction with other people. And their big insight was Facebook as the distribution channel for those games. Twitter, another example of market insight. Masses of people are more likely to write 140 characters than 1,000 words. Everybody was skeptical, but it turns out it plugged into something that was both a market and a human nature insight. It solved a need. Zipcar's insight was actually kind of interesting. is that instead of just renting cars on business trips, it might be that people in urban areas or in college campuses no longer wanted to own cars, but wanted to be able to get them with incredible flexibility, a lot more than the traditional rental car companies offered. And Zipcar actually had a market insight that made it a successful public company. So let's take a look at our JerseySquare team as an example and see how they came up with their value proposition. Now, what's interesting is if you remember, a value proposition describes not only the features, but also the pains and gains that they see that they'd actually create for the customer, and that the goal is to figure out what the MVP is. And if we see the JerseySquare team, they actually did a pretty good job talking about pains and gains, a cheaper way to wear officially licensed sports jerseys to a game, to eliminate the risk of owning a player's jersey who's going to be traded, or to provide an alternative to purchasing counterfeit jerseys. Pretty good for pains and gains. But what they forgot to describe is what are the features. And just so we could remember the features for JerseySquare is they were going to provide a single place where you could rent sports jerseys so you wouldn't have to own them and maintain them to visit your favorite team. And what they also missed is what was the MVP, or minimum viable product, of what they were going to build. And in their case, it was going to be a website with rental and stock of jerseys of the most popular teams, at first in the New York area, and then nationally in the United States, and then ultimately internationally. So those were kind of missing, but again, starting with pains and gains was pretty good for their value proposition. Notice, by the way, while they were working on value proposition, they also had some hypotheses about the customer segments. And this is a key idea, is value proposition and customer segments are the first two things you tend to work on with a business model canvas, because these two have a special name called product market fit. And product market fit just simply says, what is the match between what you're building and what customers need and want? And who are those customers? So while the goal in value prop is to figure out the MVP, as we'll see later, the goal in customer segments is to figure out who and what the archetype of the customer is. So again, you could start either with customer segments, or you could start with a product and value prop itself. It really doesn't matter. But most teams, if they're technology driven, tend to start on value prop, and most teams, if they happen to be marketeers or business people, happen to start with the customer segments. There's no right place, but it's the interaction between these two. So let's take a look at some value proposition examples. And I've selected some to just give you an idea of how other startups have approached articulating their value proposition. Here was a company that was actually trying to develop a bio-based replacement for surfactants. And they actually went out and understood the problem, came up with some solutions, and were trying to explain the pains and gains of their value proposition. Another example was a robotics agricultural weeding device. Now you notice here they're not talking about their device at all. They're talking about the problem. Is hand weeding of farm fields for organic crops is a nightmare. Another example, a company that was actually trying to figure out a better way to do cancer tests. And they actually try to understand what the problem was. And the problem was that cancer cells get detached and are circulating in the bloodstream. And oncologists and pathologists are trying to figure out whether their patients have circulating cancer tumor cells. And their features match the pain and the gain. These rest of the slides give you some examples of value propositions in medical devices, in dental care, etc. You could click on the link below for additional examples.